On April 21st, 1930, a fire broke out inside an American prison, and the men locked inside screamed until their lungs filled with smoke. They grabbed the bars of their cells and shook them with everything they had, while the guards who heard them made a choice to walk away and leave the doors locked. What followed was not simply a fire, but the single deadliest prison disaster in the history of the United States. A catastrophe nearly a century in the making, built layer by layer from neglect, overcrowding, and a system that had quietly decided these men were worth less than the fear of their escape. Tonight, we're going to tell you everything about it. There's a building that used to stand in downtown Columbus, Ohio, sitting on 22 acres of land right in the heart of the city, surrounded by stone walls that rose toward the sky. From the outside, it looked permanent, official, and immovable. From the inside, it was something else entirely. The Ohio Penitentiary opened in 1834 and was designed to hold 1,500 men. The philosophy behind it, like most prisons of that era, was straightforward in its cruelty. Silence, forced labor, and complete isolation would break a man down and rebuild him as something better. Prisoners worked in total silence during the day, and at night they were locked in solitary confinement with nothing to think about except what they had done. The routine was unbroken. The conditions were harsh, and the expectation was that suffering would eventually produce reflection. What it actually produced from the very beginning was misery. From its earliest years, the prison was defined by one thing above everything else, and that was the fact that it was always over capacity. By the time construction was fully complete, the cells were already filling faster than the building could absorb. The stone walls sweated moisture in winter and trapped unbearable heat in summer. Men slept on straw mats on stone floors before beds were eventually installed. Meals were cornbread, beans, and thin strips of bacon served without ceremony. The air inside was permanently thick and stale. Punishment inside the Ohio Penitentiary was a chapter of cruelty entirely its own. Whipping remained the primary form of discipline until 1844, and when it was finally banned, what replaced it was no less violent. Guards used something called the sweatbox, a tight, dark enclosure with no food, no water, and no air, where a man could be left for days. Prisoners were hung by their wrists from the bars of their own cells as routine punishment. In documented cases, inmates were blindfolded and struck with pressurized water hoses for minor infractions. In 1894, a newspaper reporter discovered these practices were still ongoing and condemned the state of Ohio for what he called a return to the Dark Ages. And still, no one in power changed anything. The prison became the official site of Ohio executions in 1885, when legislators transferred that responsibility from county governments to the penitentiary itself. The first method was hanging, and by 1897 the gallows had been replaced by the electric chair, making Ohio the second state in America to adopt electrocution. Over the decades that followed, 343 men and women were executed inside those walls. Guards who worked the death house reported that nobody ever volunteered for that duty, and even during the worst years of the Great Depression, when extra pay was desperately needed, officers found every excuse they could to avoid being assigned to the electric chair on execution day. That detail alone tells you something about the weight of what happened inside that building. The prison housed some well-known men alongside the thousands whose names were never recorded. The writer O. Henry, born William Sidney Porter, served time there at the turn of the century, and it was reportedly inside those walls that he began writing the short stories that would eventually make him famous. George Bugs Moran, one of the most notorious gangsters of the Prohibition era and Al Capone's chief rival in Chicago, passed through at one point. General John H. Morgan, a Confederate cavalry commander imprisoned during the Civil War, famously escaped from the facility. Sam Shepard, the Ohio doctor whose case inspired the film The Fugitive, was held there in the 1950s. These names are a reminder that the Ohio Penitentiary was not some forgotten outpost, but a central institution of American life, watched and known by the public. Beneath those famous names were thousands of men whose stories were never written down by anyone. Many of them were there because of Ohio's mandatory minimum sentencing laws, which required prison time even for minor crimes and locked men away for years for offenses that today would result in nothing more than a fine or short probation. Those laws were quietly and steadily filling the prison far beyond anything its architect had ever imagined. And by 1930, the population had reached 4,300 men in a building designed for 1,500, nearly 3 times the intended capacity. Think carefully about what that actually means in physical terms. It means men sleeping in hallways and on floors and spaces never intended for human habitation. It means the hospital ward permanently overwhelmed and unable to treat the sick properly. It means classrooms and visiting rooms converted into dormitories because there is simply nowhere else to put people. A cholera epidemic in 1849 had already swept through the facility and killed 121 men. In 1893, the prison's own superintendent wrote that 10,000 pages of history could not capture the inward wretchedness of the place, and that the unwritten history was known only by God. He wrote that nearly 40 years before the fire, and still nothing changed in any meaningful way. The wooden roof of the West Block, added to the original structure in 1875, continued to age and dry out year after year with no maintenance. There were no sprinklers anywhere in the building, no fire division walls separating the cell blocks from one another, and no centralized unlocking mechanism that would allow a guard to open multiple cells at once in an emergency. There were no evacuation protocols of any kind written down or practiced. There was a 134-foot water tower inside the prison walls holding 125,000 gallons of water, but there were no hydrants connected to it. There was fire hose stored on reels within the building, but a post-fire insurance report would later confirm there was no institutional organization in place to actually deploy any of it. In the spring of 1930, construction crews began working on an expansion of the West Block, and scaffolding went up along the outside of the building. Fresh timber was cut on site, and sawdust accumulated across the roof. Workers left behind lumber shavings, tar, and kerosene at the end of each workday. The roof above the most densely packed section of the prison was now covered in construction materials that would burn like paper, resting on a wooden structure that had been drying out for over 50 years. A single candle was all it needed. April 21st, 1930 was Easter Monday, and inside the Ohio Penitentiary, 4,300 men had spent the holiday the way they spent every other day, moving from labor to the mess hall to lockdown, without ceremony or acknowledgement of the date. By early evening, most of the inmates in the G&H cell blocks had already been secured in their cells for the night, and 800 men were behind bars in the West Block alone, stacked into tiers inside a 6-story building with a roof full of construction materials sitting directly above them. At around 5:30 in the evening, several prisoners working near the roof, and at least one guard noticed something burning on the roof above the West Block. But the first person to raise an official alarm was not a guard and was not a prison administrator. It was a passerby walking along Neal Avenue outside the prison who looked up, saw smoke rising from the roof, and called the fire department from the street. The alarm was logged at 5:39 p.m. That single fact contains the entire story of what went wrong. The people whose job it was to protect those men did not sound the alarm. A stranger on the sidewalk did. The fire had started on the roof of the West Block, where a candle had been left burning in oily rags soaked with kerosene near the construction area. The dry timber of the scaffolding caught first, then the aging wooden roof caught next, and the blaze moved with terrible speed, feeding on the sawdust and lumber shavings and tar that the construction crews had left behind at the end of the day. The roof was essentially a ready-made accelerant stretched across the top of a building full of human beings who had no way to move. Smoke poured down into the G and H cell blocks almost immediately, and 800 men locked in their cells felt it before they saw anything at all. It arrived thick and black and dense, and men started coughing before they understood what was happening. Then the screaming began. They grabbed the bars and shook them and called to the guards by name, and they begged. Every survivor account from that night describes the same sequence. The smoke arriving before the fire did, and the doors staying locked. What happened in those blocks had a racial dimension that has been largely left out of the official history of this event. The G and H cell blocks, where the smoke hit first and the death toll was highest, housed a disproportionate number of black prisoners, because racial segregation within the prison had concentrated certain populations in certain sections. Those sections happened to sit directly beneath the burning roof. African American inmates were significantly overrepresented among the dead and injured when the final counts were completed, and that was not random. It was the shape of the system expressing itself at the worst possible moment. The guards faced a decision that had no easy answer, or at least that is what they told themselves. If they opened the cells, 800 men could pour into the yard, and a mass breakout in the middle of the fire would be uncontrollable. Some guards made that calculation and kept walking. Others moved immediately to help, working through the thickening smoke to turn keys and pull open doors as fast as they could. One guard in the G and H blocks was overwhelmed by smoke before he could reach most of the cells under his watch, and he collapsed before he could finish. The people locked in the cells behind him never got out. About 50 inmates managed to escape before the smoke made any further movement through the block impossible. Then something happened that no official report would ever fully capture the way one witness later would in his writing. A handful of inmates who had not yet been locked in when the fire started made a decision that defined the night. They overpowered a guard, took his keys, and ran back into the building. Not away from it, but back into it, moving through smoke and heat, unlocking cells as fast as their hands could work, pulling men out and carrying the injured toward the yard. One prisoner made that run 12 times. 12 times he went back into a collapsing, smoke-choked, burning building to drag another man to safety, and he did not survive it. Chester Himes was 21 years old that evening, sitting in his second year of a 20-year sentence for armed robbery. He was a young man who had tested among the highest IQs on the Ohio State University campus before a series of decisions had delivered him to this place, and he was serving his sentence partly exempt from hard labor because of a back injury, which gave him time to read and to write. He would go on to become one of the most important American crime fiction writers of the 20th century, publishing novels with Knopf and Doubleday, befriending Langston Hughes and Richard Wright, and eventually leaving the United States altogether for France, where he spent the rest of his life and died in Spain in 1984. But on the evening of April 21st, he was simply a 21-year-old man watching the world around him catch fire, and what he witnessed that night shaped everything he would ever write. He saw men convicted of the worst imaginable crimes moving through smoke at full speed to save strangers they had never spoken to. He saw men who had been separated by race and violence, and every category the prison used to divide them become indistinguishable from one another in the dark. He later wrote that they were drunk from their momentary freedom and drunk from being brave for once in a cowardly life. He named the piece he wrote about it to What Red Hell, and Esquire published it in 1934. It was the first story he ever sold to a major publication, and his byline was his prison number. Outside the walls, the city of Columbus was watching smoke climb above the skyline, and families of inmates began arriving at the prison gates almost immediately. The crowd grew fast and became desperate, and guards raised machine guns to push people back from the entrance. Radio stations began broadcasting that any prisoner confirmed safe should find a way to send word, and telegraph offices and telephone exchanges were overwhelmed through the night and into the next morning as hundreds of people waited in line for their turn to send a message or make a call. Inside the perimeter, 500 soldiers from Fort Hays arrived within 30 minutes of the fire starting and surrounded the prison with loaded rifles and fixed bayonets. Machine guns were placed at the gates and at the guard towers. They were not there to help evacuate the men inside. They were there to ensure that none of those men escaped, and not one of those 500 soldiers entered the building to bring anyone out. The firefighters who arrived to fight the blaze initially could not get anywhere near it. Inmates who had watched their fellow prisoners burn while the military mobilized to contain rather than rescue them threw rocks at the fire trucks, blocking access for precious minutes. When the firefighters finally got inside, sections of the roof had already given way. The roof of the West Block caved in and came down on the upper tier of cells, and the men still locked inside those cells burned to death. By the time the fire was brought under control that evening, 322 men were dead, and another 230 had been hospitalized. The horticulture building of the Ohio State Fairgrounds was converted into a makeshift morgue, and rows of coffins filled the hall. Some bodies had been so badly burned they could not be identified, and some families never received a confirmed answer about what had happened to the person they were looking for. Chester Himes saw the bodies of the dead left in the yard during the initial cleanup, and he did not look away. Within hours of the fire being brought under control, prison officials had an answer prepared for the press. They said 3 inmates had started it deliberately as part of an escape attempt. The men named were James Raymond, 30 years old and imprisoned for burglary, along with Hugh Gibbons, 29, and Clinton Great, 34. The story, as officials told it, was that Raymond had constructed a simple incendiary device by placing a lit candle in a pan of kerosene-soaked rags near the construction materials on the roof. The idea was that the candle would burn down slowly and ignite the kerosene after the evening meal, when the population would be in the mess hall and the resulting chaos of a fire would cover their escape. The plan, if that was truly what it was, went catastrophically wrong. The device ignited too early. The men were not in position to move, and 322 people died. There was a significant problem with the official story, and it was a problem that could never be resolved. Both Raymond and Great died by suicide in the months following the fire, meaning 2 of the 3 men formally blamed for the worst prison disaster in American history were dead before any proper investigation could examine the evidence or hear their account. The third man, Hugh Gibbons, largely disappeared from the official record. Historians looking back at this case have been asking the same question ever since. How convenient was it that the 2 men most central to the accusation could never speak for themselves? The prison administration had behaved catastrophically on the night of April 21st. Guards had refused to open cells while men burned. No emergency protocol had been followed by anyone in a position of authority. The building had no fire safety infrastructure of any kind. The death toll was catastrophic, and the press was already calling the disaster preventable in headlines across the country. Blaming 3 inmates, 2 of whom were now dead and unable to dispute anything, offered a clean and closed narrative that redirected public attention away from every institutional failure that had actually made those deaths inevitable. The alternative theory required no conspiracy at all and no malicious intent from anyone. The construction site on the roof was full of flammable materials left unsecured and unattended at the end of a workday, and a work lamp or a candle left burning by accident would have been enough. The roof had been bone dry for over 50 years and did not need sabotage to become a catastrophe. It needed only a moment of inattention. What neither theory changes is the essential truth of what happened that night. Regardless of how the first flame appeared, 322 men died because mandatory sentencing laws had packed a building designed for 1,500 with nearly 3 times that number. They died because the roof above them had been allowed to rot for decades without repair. They died because there was a water tower full of water inside the walls and nothing to connect it to a fire. They died because some guards decided that a potential escape was a greater risk than a certain death, and the system had taught them to think exactly that way. The formal investigation that followed was condemned by the press almost immediately as insufficient, and it dragged on for years without resolution. Testimony was still being heard as late as January 1935, nearly 5 years after the event, and the questions were never given satisfactory answers. The blame remained formally assigned to men who could no longer dispute it, and the administration continued operating the prison as though the fire had been an isolated incident rather than the predictable outcome of decades of neglect. In the 2 weeks after the fire, the surviving inmates refused to return to their hard labor, which was the only form of protest the system allowed them. Men who had been divided by race and by years of mutual hostility refused to cooperate with the guards who had left their fellow prisoners to die, and that refusal was documented, noted, and reported in the press. It added real and sustained pressure to an institution that was already under the most intense public scrutiny it had ever faced, and it made it harder for the state to simply bury what had happened and move on. The morning after the fire, families stood outside the prison gates in a silence that was different in quality from the desperation of the night before. The frantic crowd had become still and patient in the way that only grief produces. People held photographs of their fathers and brothers and sons and waited for names to be read aloud. The radio stations were still broadcasting updates, and some families waited through the entire next day without receiving any confirmation at all. For some of the men who died inside that building, the fire had erased even their names from any recoverable record, and their families went home without an answer. The press was not restrained in its response and did not soften its language for the sake of the institutions involved. Newspapers across the country used the same word in headline after headline: preventable. Editors pointed to the overcrowding that had been allowed to continue for decades, to the rotting roof that had never been repaired, to the complete absence of fire safety infrastructure, and to the guards who had kept cells locked while the smoke rose around them. The public response was angry and sustained enough that it forced real legislative action from the Ohio state government. The Ohio Parole Board was established in 1931 as a direct consequence of the fire. Mandatory minimum sentencing laws for minor offenses were repealed because those laws had been identified as the primary driver of the overcrowding that made the disaster as deadly as it was. Within a single year of the Parole Board's creation, more than 2,300 prisoners from the Ohio Penitentiary alone were released on parole, and the building that had been holding nearly 3 times its intended population began to breathe for the first time in decades. The reforms did not bring back the dead, but they acknowledged in law what the overcrowding had actually done to those men. Fire safety codes for correctional facilities were written and adopted nationwide in the aftermath of the disaster. Sprinkler systems became a legal requirement in new prison construction. Fire division walls were mandated to prevent a blaze from sweeping across cell blocks the way it had in Columbus, and centralized unlocking mechanisms that allow a single guard to open multiple cells simultaneously in an emergency became standard practice. The results of those changes were measurable and consistent. The number of fires in American prisons and jails declined steadily from 1930 onward, and by 1980, there were only 4 fires recorded across all correctional facilities in the country.